A man starts cooking breakfast for 3 alien children he barely knows, and somewhere across the galaxy an empress watches through hidden cameras and quietly begins to cry. Marcus Webb had no plan. He was a retired combat cook from the Outer Rim conflict, living alone in a frontier apartment on Kepler station, making maybe 400 credits a month, doing short order work at a diner that smelled like recycled grease and broken dreams. He wasn't looking for a story. He wasn't looking for anything but fate, or the universe, or whatever you want to call it, had other ideas, because the woman who moved in next door wasn't just a single mother trying to survive. She was running from something enormous, and the 3 kids she brought with her, small, strange, quietly terrified, were about to change everything Marcus thought he understood about food, family, and what it means to be human in a galaxy that doesn't always care about your species. Kepler Station was the kind of place people ended up not chose. It sat at the alien corridor, a trading waypoint that had seen better centuries. The docks smelled like coolant and synthetic protein, and the apartment blocks were stacked so high that the top floors never saw natural light. Marcus lived on floor 14, Unit C, in a 2-room apartment that had exactly 1 window, 1 working burner, and a view of a ventilation shaft he'd named Gerald. He liked Gerald. Gerald never asked him anything. The day everything changed started like every other day. Marcus woke up at 5:30, made himself black coffee with a press that was held together by a strip of thermal tape, and stood at his window watching the loading docks below while the station slowly came alive. He wasn't depressed exactly. He was just paused. The Outer Rim conflict had ended 18 months ago, and he'd come home from it quieter than he left, not broken, just rearranged. He worked the breakfast and lunch shift at Devo's Diner, 3 blocks from his apartment. He could cook pretty much anything, standard human fare, some Velian grain dishes, a couple of Korathi protein plates he'd learned from a sergeant who died at Callisto 3. Cooking was the one thing the war hadn't taken from him. If anything, it had sharpened it. When everything else is chaos, putting food on a plate means something. It means someone is going to eat. It means somebody decided they were worth feeding in the middle of a war. That's not a small decision. He heard them before he saw them. 2 days after the conflict anniversary, he was in the hallway with his grocery bag when the door to 14D opened, and out came the chaos. 3 children, small, maybe 3 to 7 years old in human terms, though he'd later learn their ages were impossible to translate directly, spilled into the corridor like they'd been held at pressure. They had pale blue-gray skin, large dark eyes that caught light the way certain minerals do, and what Marcus could only describe as antennae, delicate, translucent, curling slightly at the tip. They froze when they saw him. He froze when he saw them. For about 2 full seconds nobody did anything. Then the smallest one, he'd eventually learn her name was Ja, pointed at his grocery bag and said, in perfect, slightly too formal standard, "Is that food?" Marcus looked down at the bag. "Yeah." He said, "We haven't eaten today," she said, not dramatically, just as a beery fact, the kind of fact a child states when they've learned that stating facts is more reliable than asking for things. In behind them, their mother appeared in the doorway. She was tall, maybe 62, with the same blue-gray complexion and dark eyes. She wore simple clothes, station standard workers' coveralls, and she had the look of someone who hadn't slept in 48 hours and was getting very efficient at hiding it. She saw his face, she saw him looking at the children, and she said quietly, "I'm sorry, they're curious, we won't bother you." Marcus looked at the bag, he looked at the kids, he looked at the mother. "I was about to make eggs," he said. "I've got enough." The mother, her name was Vel. He learned later, though, that wasn't her real name, just the closest translation. Said nothing for a long moment, then she nodded once like she was accepting a treaty. That was the first breakfast. He scrambled the eggs with a little of the dried herb mix he kept in a tin, added some flatbread from the diners, leftovers that he always brought home, because throwing food away felt criminal to him, and set it out on his small table. The three kids, Shah and the two older ones who introduced themselves as Dave and Oren, sat very straight and waited. Their mother stood near the door. Marcus noticed she didn't sit. He put a plate down for her anyway and didn't comment. Shah took the first bite of egg, her antennae rose straight up. She looked at Marcus with an expression he would later come to recognize as the Velian equivalent of absolute joy. "This," she said very seriously, "is the best thing." Marcus almost laughed, almost. Instead, he just nodded. "Glad you like it," he said, and that was it. That was the whole beginning of everything. Here's the thing nobody tells you about feeding someone's kids. You can't do it once, because the next morning the door to 14D was cracked open and all three children were sitting in the hallway, waiting like small patient statues. They weren't knocking, they weren't asking. They were just present the way animals and children are present when they've decided to trust something, quietly, totally, without room for negotiation. It became a thing, not an announced thing, not a scheduled thing, just a thing that existed. Every morning Marcus made breakfast. He made extra every morning. The door to 14D was open before he even reached the hallway. It was as if the kids had some kind of biological alarm system tuned specifically to the sound of his coffee press. He started paying attention to what they liked. Oren, the oldest, was fascinated by textures. Anything crunchy was practically a religious experience for him. Dave, the middle child, was suspicious of anything that smelled too strongly and needed everything described to him before he'd try it, and Saya ate everything immediately, without ceremony, and then looked at Marcus with those enormous dark eyes like he had personally handed her the secrets of the universe. Vel joined them at the table on the fourth morning. She still didn't say much, but she sat, and that Marcus had learned in the war was its own kind of communication. When someone's been running long enough, sitting down is a statement. It means for right now this is safe enough. He didn't comment on that either. He started expanding the menu. He had a good pantry instinct. Years of military cooking where you improvised constantly or people didn't eat, and he began researching Velian dietary compatibility in the evenings, cross-referencing what he knew about their biology with what he had available on the station. He found that they couldn't process certain earth spices safely, but that they responded extremely well to fermented flavors, slow-cooked proteins, and anything with a high mineral content. He started adding trace mineral supplements to their food, barely noticeable, dissolved in the cooking liquid. After reading that species struggled to get adequate intake on Station processed rations. He didn't tell Vel what he was doing. He just did it because that's what you do when you're feeding people who need something, and you have the knowledge to provide it. On the 9th day, Josenteni started doing something new, a gentle, rhythmic pulsing that he'd never seen before. Vel noticed him looking and said quietly, "That means she's content. Deeply content. In our culture, it's considered a very private display. She normally only does that at home." Marcus nodded. "Good to know," he said, and went back to the pan. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Vel knocked on his door. She was standing in the hallway in the same worker's coveralls, holding a small ceramic container. "For you," she said. "It's a condiment from home. I thought you might like to try it." She paused. "You've been adding minerals to the food, I noticed. I want you to know I've noticed." Marcus took the container. It smelled like smoked earth and something sweet underneath. "Is it going to melt my tongue off?" he asked. "Probably not," she said, and for the first time she almost smiled. He tried it that night on a piece of flatbread. It was extraordinary, dense and complex, and unlike anything he'd had before. He spent 20 minutes trying to figure out what it reminded him of, and eventually decided it was like if miso paste and dark chocolate and a thunderstorm had a meeting and agreed on something. He used it in the scrambled eggs. The next morning, all 3 children went silent when they tasted it. Then Ja looked up, and teen vibrating, and said, "You put home in the eggs." Marcus didn't know what to say to that, so he just said, "Yeah." Over the weeks that followed, he and Vel developed a strange, comfortable rhythm. She worked odd hours doing something she described vaguely as administrative coordination, which he didn't probe. She was clearly careful about what she shared. He respected that. He'd been careful too once. Still was in some ways. What they talked about mostly was food. She told him about Velan cuisine, the multi-stage fermentation processes, the way that communal meals were structured around the youngest eater's preferences, the cultural weight of preparing food for someone else's children, which in Velan society was one of the most serious commitments a person could make. He told her about military cooking, about feeding 200 people out of a field kitchen with half the equipment and a third of the supplies, about the way that feeding people in the middle of a war felt like the one act of sanity you had left. She listened to everything attentively in a way that felt almost studied. He noticed as the weeks passed that she asked very precise questions, not probing, not interrogating, just precise, like someone assembling a very careful picture. He didn't know what picture. He didn't know yet that she'd been assembling it for a reason, that the reason was enormous, that the reason was in fact the fate of an entire succession. And then one day he came home from his shift to find 3 people in black uniforms standing outside his apartment door, and Vel standing between them and him with an expression on her face that he had never seen before. Not frightened, not surprised, but cold. Absolutely cold. Like every warm thing she'd ever allowed herself had been folded up and put somewhere out of reach, and something in that coldness made the hair on his arms stand up. Because it wasn't the coldness of someone scared, it was the coldness of someone who had been something very large for a very long time, and who was letting herself be that thing again. Right now in this hallway in front of him, the 3 figures in black weren't Military exactly, their uniforms had no insignia he recognized, but they carried themselves with the particular stillness of people who were very good at violence and didn't need to announce it. One of them said something in a language he didn't know. Vel answered in the same language. The exchange was short and clipped and ended with the three figures walking past Marcus without looking at him and into the apartment across the hall. Vel waited until the door closed. Then she turned to Marcus and said quietly, "I owe you an explanation." He'd suspected on some level, not the details, never the details, but the shape of it, the odd hours, the careful questions, the way she never talked about where she came from except in the abstract, the way her children sometimes lapsed into a formality that seemed too practice for kids their age, catching themselves dialing back to something more ordinary. He'd seen people hiding before. He'd done it himself. He knew the texture of it. They sat at his table. She looked at the ceramic condiment jar he kept on the counter, the one she'd given him, and she said, "My name is not Vel, my name is Velisara Nadorath," which in your phonetics sounds something like Velisara. I am the sovereign regent of the Dorith succession. My people are currently in the middle of a succession dispute that has lasted 6 of your years. My children are the heirs to that succession, and 9 weeks ago, when a faction attempted to remove them from my care permanently, I ran. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Permanently meaning?" "Yes," she said. Looked at the condiment jar. He thought about J's antennae pulsing that first time she was truly content. He thought about Dave eating for him to describe everything before he'd eat it. He thought about Oren eating an entire bowl of toasted grain with the focus of someone discovering religion. He thought about a queen in workers' coveralls who hadn't slept in 48 hours, standing in a doorway telling her children they wouldn't bother the neighbor. "How long have you been running?" he asked. 14 months, she said. He did the math. Kepler Station was their longest stop, 9 weeks. The others had probably been shorter, harder, more terrifying. And through all of it she'd been keeping 3 small kids fed and clothed and quiet and alive on a frontier station in the wrong corner of the galaxy, with no one to help her and no one she could trust enough to ask. "People in the black uniforms," he said. "Envoys from the faction," she said. "They found us. They've given me 48 hours to comply or leave with nothing." "What does comply mean?" She was quiet for a moment. "It means I formally abdicate. The children are placed with regents of the factions choosing, and I return to Dorith alone as a private citizen." He thought about that, and leaving with nothing means exactly that. "We go. We have no documents, no credits, no legal standing under any treaty I know of on any station within 3 systems." He stood up, went to the counter and started making coffee, not because he wanted it, but because doing something with his hands helped him think. That was something the war had given him, the understanding that action, even small action, keeps the mind from seizing up when the weight gets heavy. "How much money do you need?" he said. "Marcus, I'm not asking out of obligation. I'm asking as a logistical question." She named the figure. It was more than he had in his pocket, but it was not unreachable. He had a savings account he hadn't touched since before the war, because he hadn't had anything to spend it on, hadn't had anything he cared about enough to spend it on until now. Apparently, There's something else, she said. He turned around. She told him about the Veth Corridor, a system 6 days out under a different transit authority beyond the faction's jurisdiction. She told him about the Corridor Treaty. Old law almost never invoked that would give her legal standing to contest the faction's authority directly if she could reach it, and she told him what she needed from him. She needed a human travel document sponsor because the transit authority at Veth honored the accord of 12 species and humans were one of the 12. A sponsored human transit companion could bring 2 dependents and 3 wards under umbrella passage. Marcus stared at her. You need me to travel with you. I need a human, she said. I've been trying to find one who would understand, who I could trust. For 9 weeks I have watched you feed my children every morning without being asked, without expecting anything, without making it something it wasn't. You put minerals in their food without telling me. You looked up their biology and adjusted everything you cooked so they would be healthy. She paused. In Velian culture, feeding someone's children that carefully is a declaration. It means you intend them to thrive. It is not a small thing. Marcus looked at his coffee. I didn't know that, he said. I know, she said. That's why I trust you. And GT, clears throat. And GT, he sat down. He thought for about 30 seconds, which was a long time for him. Then he pulled out a data pad. My passport's current, he said. I'll need to file a transit companion declaration by tomorrow morning. You said the kids in your law, are they heirs with documented status? She nodded. Under Doroth succession law, yes, their status is encoded in genetic markers. Any legitimate medical scan would confirm it. Good. I know a doctor on level 3 who does off-record scans for station workers. We get their medical baseline documented before we leave. Once we hit Veth, that documentation becomes part of your legal claim. You want old law? We build old law brick by brick. She was very still. You're not going to ask me what this costs you? I know what it costs me, he said. I'm okay with it. She looked at him for a long time. Her antennae, he'd seen them maybe twice before, always partially covered, rose slightly. He'd learned to read them a little by then. This expression was something he'd never seen before, something between grief and relief, so enormous it had nowhere else to go but outward. Then she said there was one more thing. When they reached the corridor, when she stood before the transit authority and invoked the treaty, the faction would know immediately. Everything that happened after would be public. Her identity, her children's identity, all of it. And he would have been the one who stood with them. She wanted him to understand what that meant in her culture, in Doroth history, the one who stands with the sovereign when she reclaims her throne is written into the record. Permanently, he would be in that record. His name, the fact that he fed her children eggs and flatbread on a station at the edge of nowhere. Marcus thought about this. He thought about Gerald, the ventilation shaft. He thought about his one-window apartment and the 400 credits a month and the war and everything it had arranged in him, moving things around until he was a different shape but still somehow himself. Will the eggs make it into the record, he asked. She stared at him. Because the herb mix was from a sergeant who died at Callisto 3, he said. I'd like him to be in the record too. Har knew, for the first time since he'd known her, Velisara Nadarath, sovereign regent of the Doroth succession, laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one, and her antennae rose completely, golden-tipped. In the kitchen light, Ansea appeared. In the hallway behind them, drawn by the sound, blinking with the particular alarm of a child who has never heard her mother laugh like that and isn't sure what universe she's walked into. Is there food? Saya asked. Marcus stood up. There will be, he said. They made it to the Veth corridor in 5 days. Not 6, Marcus would later say. The transit was boring mostly. Dav spent the entire journey insisting Marcus describe every single meal option available on the ship in full detail before committing to any of them. Oren discovered the crunch of freeze-dried station crackers and had to be gently rationed, and Saya fell asleep on Marcus's shoulder somewhere around day 3 and woke up and said, "You're warm for a human," and he said, "Thanks. I've been working on it," and she found that so funny she told it to her mother, who told it to the Veth Transit Authority welcome delegation, who wrote it down in the official record, which is probably not what official records are. But nobody argued. The hearing took 4 hours. Marcus stood in the back in his best clothes, which were a clean shirt and a jacket he'd bought at a station resale shop for 20 credits. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His name on the transit declaration was enough. His humanity was enough. The Accord of 12 species, 500 years old and gathering dust in some archive nobody had opened in generations, did exactly what Vel had said it would. The faction's authority was suspended pending review. The children's status was confirmed, and Velisara Nadoreth walked out of that hearing room with her head level and her antennae raised, and 3 kids beside her who had absolutely no idea how significant the last 96 hours had been, because nobody had thought it useful to explain it to them. In the hallway after, Oren tugged Marcus's sleeve. "Are you going to make breakfast tomorrow?" he asked. "Probably," Marcus said. "Good," said Oren, and that was that. Marcus did stay, not for reasons he could fully articulate, not for romance, not for the history books, not even for the record, though the record was real and his name was in it, and so was a footnote about the herb mix and the sergeant from Callisto 3. He stayed because 3 small alien children had eaten eggs at his table and felt for the first time in 14 months like they were somewhere safe, and because some part of him, the part they war hadn't rearranged, understood that this was what he was for, not the fighting, not the surviving, this the pan, the table, the small faces looking up at him like he was doing something important. He was doing something important. Vel never formally thanked him. That wasn't the Velian way, but she translated his recipe for the scrambled eggs, the exact proportions, the herb blend, the mineral addition, the method, and had it formally inscribed in the Doroth Cultural Archive under a designation that translated roughly as the food that meant we were kept, which, in their tradition, was not a recipe. It was a promise, a record of intent, proof that someone had looked at you and decided you deserved to thrive. Years later, she would become one of the most respected diplomatic figures in the Doroth succession. She would be known, among other things, for her insistence that every formal diplomatic function include a shared meal. Food is the first declaration, she would say in interviews and speeches. In the textbooks they wrote about her, it says, "I intend you to thrive." Her advisors always assumed it was an old Velian proverb. It was something a retired combat cook from Kepler Station had shown her without knowing he was teaching anything at all. If this story hit different, if you want more HFY tales about ordinary humans doing extraordinary things in a universe that wasn't built for them, there's a full playlist right here, and the algorithm actually does reward clicking it immediately, so let's make the algorithm happy together. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because the next story coming is about a human janitor on a prison ship who keeps the entire crew alive through a catastrophic systems failure using nothing but emergency rations and the kind of stubbornness that makes other species deeply uncomfortable. That one drops soon, and you do not want to miss it.